Hi, I'm Marcella Billick. Welcome to my third and final lecture in this series, where we will look at climate change responses. In particular, we will identify groups that are taking positive action to mitigate climate change, as well as those who are stalling. And we will try to understand what motivates these actions. Just to recap the last lecture, we looked at the seriousness of the problem, as well as existing technology and solutions. We found that rapid emissions reductions are needed to mitigate serious climate change. The technologies required to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions already exist, and many can compete with established technologies on cost, while others need policy incentives and investment to overcome their green premiums and progress their learning curves that will make them cost competitive in the long run. As we know from our last discussion, a detailed roadmap for how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 exists. It is contained in the Energy Transitions Commission report, Making Mission Possible. This plan requires rapid action on 10 key priorities by 2030, each needing to be addressed in collaboration by a group of stakeholders, these being policymakers, innovators, energy producers, producers of goods and services, consumers, and investors. Because the technologies we need already exist, innovators are only required to meet one priority, which is to work with producers to focus R&D on critical technology targets, such as reducing costs of solutions in the hard-to-abate sectors. Energy producers need to create massive capacity of zero carbon power generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure, and to work with producers of goods and services and consumers to achieve value chain efficiencies. Consumers and producers of goods and services must also cooperate in value chain contexts to shift to exclusively electric light-duty vehicles, to improve material efficiencies and recycling for all products and services, and to test new technologies. Producers must also drive ambitious and systematic energy efficiency programs in the building sector and work with innovators on the critical emerging technologies. Investors must prioritize funding for zero carbon power generation and associated infrastructure, for energy efficiency programs in the building sector, and channel investment into the transition of high emissions activities. Policymakers are needed across nearly all objectives to provide effective incentives for all the other stakeholders to cooperate towards these priorities and to provide stable policy frameworks to facilitate the long-term cooperation needed to achieve these goals. The good news is that appropriate actions are increasingly being taken by the majority of these stakeholders. However, the actions are still too fragmented. Unfortunately, the coherent policy frameworks required to incentivize effective and rapid collaboration are still lacking. Action to mitigate climate change and shift our activities to zero emissions alternatives is being taken across growing numbers of businesses that include energy producers and producers of goods and services, as well as financiers and investors. These organisations are increasingly acting individually as well as in consortia, such as, for example, the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative. Those taking serious action are typically professional businesses whose boards seek the most accurate information, take science seriously, and know how to tap the advice of experts. There is no climate change denial in the boardrooms of big successful businesses because they know that climate change presents significant threats to their future profitability and in some cases their very existence. They understand that there is a clear consensus of the science and that the evidence for anthropogenic climate change is overwhelming. So they are preparing adaptation strategies and trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in anticipation of inevitable global policies for greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. They are also increasingly forming consortia to magnify their impact through collaboration with cognate businesses. Innovators in academia, research institutes, and company R&D divisions have access to the scientific literature and the technical knowledge required to understand the scientific consensus. They are also usually highly motivated to solve pressing technology problems. Hence, they prioritize work on technologies required to attain zero greenhouse gas emission economies. Consumer and government responses to climate change, on the other hand, are a lot more varied, and there appears to be significant confusion about the science and urgency for action in these groups that is dramatically hampering the overall progress. The lack of policy frameworks for these coordinated actions is particularly problematic as we lose the efficiencies that come with coherent cooperation. To tackle this problem of lack of action of policymakers in government and consumers in the general public, we first need to understand what is causing it. The majority of consumers do not have access to the scientific literature, and even if they did, their training in the relevant fields is usually not sufficient to interpret it. They therefore rely on secondary sources, including the World Wide Web and news media, for their understanding of climate change science. Recent studies by social scientists, such as historian Naomi Oreskes from Harvard University, have revealed highly organized and sophisticated campaigns deployed by the fossil fuel industry. These campaigns include funding directed to politicians and the dissemination of information to the general public, which obscures consensus in the climate science literature and builds false perceptions of a climate change controversy. As intended, these false perceptions influence the choices people make as voters and as consumers, hampering efforts to combat climate change. Their lack of appreciation of the certainty of the science leads to inaction on their part. However, policymakers in government have access to both the scientific literature and to advisors that can interpret it accurately. The reason many elected governments are failing to act is because they receive campaign funding from and pressure from lobby groups that profit from fossil fuels, and the majority of voters in their electorates are not demanding that they enact serious climate change mitigation policies. Unfortunately, although they have access to it, policymakers see scientific advice as optional. They are eager to cite it and engage scientists in their communication with electorates when it suits their objectives, especially to build public acceptance from unpopular measures taken to mitigate crises on shorter timescales that would affect their re-election prospects, such as COVID-19. The best way to motivate governments to do their part is for the majority of voters to demand that they enact policy measures to mitigate climate change. But current research suggests that this will require overcoming extensive, large-scale, well-orchestrated and highly successful misinformation campaigns. There is a history of well-documented campaigns engineered to cast doubt on climate change caused by human actions. In the early 1990s, Western Fuel Association ran a marketing campaign to reposition global warming as theory, not fact. A climate change denial movement was established with fossil fuel industry funding. It employs fake expert strategies to cast doubt on the scientific consensus about global warming. Examples include the 1995 Leipzig Declaration, the 1997 Cooler Heads Coalition, and the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine's Global Warming Petition Project in 1998. Over a decade after such industry groups and conservative think tanks had begun misinformation campaigns, scientists started quantifying the scientific agreement that human activities cause global warming. Despite the research establishing overwhelming consensus, misinformation projecting scientific disagreement about climate change continues to be prolific and persistent. An analysis of the conservative columns about climate change from 2007 to 2010 found that the most common argument was there is no scientific consensus. In 2017, the Heartland Institute mailed copies of a book called Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming to 25,000 science teachers across the USA. In late 2018, President Trump argued that you have scientists on both sides of the issue. This constant stream of no consensus messaging has had a major impact on public perceptions. Surveys of public perceptions of the scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change over the past decade show a significant but gradually decreasing gap between the public estimates, over 30% to just under 60%, and the actual level of consensus, which is approximately 97% amongst climate scientists. These numbers come from US surveys, but data suggests that the situation in Australia is similar. Opponents of climate action have focused on discrediting the consensus in climate science because they know that anti-consensus messaging decreases public support for climate change mitigation policies. As early as 1998, a report by the American Petroleum Institute concluded that informing people that some scientists did not believe humans were causing global warming made them more likely to oppose the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Testing of a range of misinforming statements about climate change found that an attack on scientific consensus was the most effective in reducing public acceptance of climate change. Communicating even modest amounts of dissent among experts has been shown to be effective in reducing support for environmental policy. The Gateway Belief Model explains why misinformation targeting the scientific consensus on climate change is so effective at delaying policies. Because many subjects in science are too complex to understand without years of study, members of the public quite rightly look to scientific consensus as a way to gauge what science already understands and has revealed as truth versus what scientists are still working out and trying to understand. This is nicely illustrated by this diagram depicting how an appreciation of the high level of consensus among scientists causes a shift in attitudes, leading to a belief in climate change and its human causation, which generates the concern about its future impacts, which in turn underpins support for public action. A number of recent studies in psychology support this model. It also seems to be the foundation of many of the misinformation campaigns on climate change that aim solely to manufacture doubt about the scientific consensus. The quote shown on the slide from a memorandum to the Bush White House articulates this clearly by saying, "Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming in the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate." I believe that those of us who are privileged enough to have access to the scientific literature and to have the training to be able to understand it have an obligation to communicate it. Now we will look at some aspects of the way scientific information is typically communicated that may work against us. In fact, these phenomena currently assist those seeking to generate doubt about the scientific consensus. The first is that reputable journalists typically try to report all sides of a story. And in the context of climate change, that means that the small minority of dissenting views, often fabricated by vested interests, get disproportionately more coverage, thus reinforcing the no consensus message. The diagram on the left from Boykoff et al. Shows a breakdown of the US prestige press, meaning the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal's coverage of anthropogenic global warming in the period 1988 to 2002, covering 340 reports. It demonstrates that the US prestige press coverage of global warming in this period has given significantly more attention to dissenting views than is warranted by their prevalence in the scientific community. Hence, these efforts of balanced reporting have contributed to the significant divergence of the popular appreciation of climate science consensus from the actual scientific consensus. The graph on the right from Shapiro shows that public perceptions of scientific consensus are closer to the true value in countries where journalists also state in their reports which of the competing views they present is more credible. The second phenomenon that interferes with accurate messaging about the scientific consensus has become prevalent only recently, as access to the internet and the popularity of social media has increased. Powerful groups that wish to spread misinformation populate blogs, opinion feedback channels for online articles, and social media with their messaging, giving the impression to other users of these platforms that these messages represent views prevalent in the community. Based on the illusion that many fellow citizens hold these views, others are converted and often even contribute to the spread of this misleading information by sharing it with their friends. This practice means that we have no idea whether we are reading genuine converging views of many individuals online or corporate propaganda. Unfortunately, many people tend to believe opinions that are repeated often and that they believe others agree with. The problem is further accentuated by the fact that our internet information feeds are designed to give us information that reinforces material with which we have previously engaged, simply because people are more likely to engage with information that they already believe, and advertising dollars depend on user engagement. This enhances the power of wealthy interest groups to manipulate public opinion. With so much misleading information out there, you need to be very critical about what you believe and share. Please remember that by sharing misleading information, you are working for those who seek to mislead and misleading others. Before you believe it or share it, do some independent searches. And by independent, I mean searches that do not rely on links in the article that you are assessing. Use keywords that appear in the story in new independent searches to find other information on the same topics. Check whether the story is consistent with other things you find published by credible outlets, and if not, don't share that information. Also, always find out who is disseminating the information before you believe or share it. Do further independent research on these sources. Are they credible and independent? Are they companies, news corporations, or scientific journals, for example? How do they obtain their funding? If it is through donations, who donates? If it is through advertising, who places the most lucrative advertisements? Think about how they or their funders might stand to benefit from your believing the information they are presenting. If you can see a benefit, be suspicious and don't share that information. Does the information you are trying to verify cite its sources? If not, ask yourself why not. Might there be something to hide? If sources were cited, always check them too. Are they consistent with the message portrayed? Are they credible? If not, then again, don't share that information. I would like to end by summarizing what we have learned over the last 3 lectures. In our examination of the scientific method and peer-reviewed publishing of science, we see that the rigor in these processes makes long-standing controversy in science highly unlikely. Indeed, it is amazing how well science has served us in predicting all of the phenomena that underpin the huge number of amazing technologies that modern life now depends on. An examination of the scientific literature shows that there is an overwhelming consensus that human-caused climate change is real, and the effects predicted by the science are becoming more and more apparent. We know that to avoid serious disruptive climate outcomes, we must eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, reaching zero no later than 2050, with massive reductions in emissions required over the next decade. All of the technology we need for this task exists, and much of it is already cost competitive, and the rest will become competitive through learning curves once we start to utilize it at scale. There are well-researched transition roadmaps to follow that clearly define what needs to be done in sequence, and they estimate transition costs of less than a few percent of GDP. So the required reductions are within our reach. Innovators, investors, and producers are already trying to implement the changes, but government policy to coordinate and further incentivize these actions is urgently needed. It is our job as citizens who have the privilege to be able to access and evaluate reliable research to ensure that all those who can influence public policy in any way, even if only by voting or taking part in opinion surveys, know these facts. Thank you for watching.